prayer, we know we need to do it. We try to do it. We hope to do it. Maybe we even have to schedule it, because otherwise there tend to be more pressing matters, probably a lot more pressing matters. If we were honest, prayer is hard. I mean, you're supposed to be having a conversation with God, of course, but still, it's a different kind of conversation, right? I don't know about you, but mine tend to be more on the monologue side than the dialogue side. I don't hear much from the other party, do you? The answers are delayed, cryptic, puzzling, unanswered, and sometimes prayer is kind of disappointing or weird, even uncomfortable, like I'm just sitting around hearing myself talk. Sometimes obligatory comments and observations, other times desperate petitions, really desperate. Which is why this passage from John kind of rocks my world. How often do you get to hear a prayer about you, for you, on behalf of you? What is it about overhearing a prayer that really makes a difference? Because here's the thing, once someone finds out you are even remotely religious, you get to be the official prayer. I always dreaded that. When people first knew that I was in seminary and they found out that I was studying religion, or I had graduated from seminary, or an internship, there was this inevitable, is there a pastor in the house? And you always got asked to pray. And I always wanted to say, listen, people, I never took that class at seminary, that spontaneous prayer class. I never had that. There's something quite touching, though, quite poignant, that this text from John is the designated gospel reading by the Revised Common Lectionary for the last Sunday of Easter. It is Jesus' prayer for his disciples that his disciples actually get to hear. There's no stay there while I go and pray, or no wake up disciples, clap, 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 wake up. But a foot washing, comforting words of accompaniment, the promise of the Paraclete, and now a prayer for them, for their present and their future. I kind of think about when I was a child, and I was saying my bedtime prayers, but I wasn't saying them, my mom was saying them. And I got to overhear her because she prayed for me when I didn't have the words yet to do it myself. You have to wonder, though, what the disciples thought about at this point. I mean, what did they actually hear? I think there could have been some serious selective hearing going on. Did they hear words of encouragement, of protection, of unity, or did they hear that they would be hated, that they don't belong to the world, that they would be abandoned, that Jesus is really leaving for good? In the words of Emily Towns, were they scrambling to rearrange the deck chairs on their Titanic theology that they had built around Jesus? Or were they just oblivious, in denial, devastated? Or maybe quite possibly, sadly, all of the above. So I wonder if they overlooked the one line so easily passed over in this prayer, so quickly taken for granted, or so unbelievable that it must be, maybe even has to be ignored. I wonder if they could hear joy. I speak these things in the world so that they may have my joy made complete in themselves, says Jesus. When can you hear joy, and when can't you? Can we only hear joy when we know joy, or when we are in a moment of joy? Or do we need to hear, can we hear joy or know joy when we least feel it or expect it? When it seems the most absent or the most impossible? I think there's something extraordinarily and devastatingly elusive about joy. It's not mere happiness and how much we pretend that it is. That if we could just be happy or optimistic, that there's an expected equivalence, that joy would just then automatically follow. But true joy, when do we know it? When do we feel it? Even the usual times and places that we name as moments of joy are not always the case, not necessarily so. The birth of your first child, a graduation, a remission of cancer. Is joy possible ever again when depression has taken its hold, when the only hope seems like the sacrifice of yourself, when giving into who you are means giving up on who you thought you should be? And how can there be joy when there's a betrayal at hand, when injustice will most certainly occur, when death is inevitable? Seriously, Jesus, what are you talking about? In the words of a guy I know named Nicodemus, how can these things be? The joy of which Jesus speaks, the joy that might become complete, made full, fully, provided fully in every single one of Jesus' believers, happens to be a perfect passive verb. That is, we have been filled with the joy of Jesus, but that joy is forever in our present. In other words, this is abundant joy. Like everything else that is abundant from Jesus, the best wine when you least expect it, acceptance in the midst of ample rejection, nourishment when it seems that most will be left hungry, light when there is utter darkness, sight when there has been only blindness, a new community when one has been thrown out of the fold, life when there is absolute and certain death. I find it interesting that the Greek words for grace and joy are only 2 degrees of separation. 2 letters to be exact. As if perhaps grace and joy are related. As if joy could be the feeling of grace upon grace. I think it's remarkable that Jesus in this prayer holds both together at the same time. The inevitability of sorrow, the expectation of suffering, the knowledge of betrayal, with the absolute certainty of joy. The joy of which Jesus speaks breaks into every abandonment, every hopelessness, every pain, every fear. Maybe this is the true meaning of the resurrection, how we can imagine the joy of the resurrection carrying forward beyond Easter. Because let's face it, it's no easier to live out the resurrection than it is to live into the reality of the incarnation. No wonder one church sign I saw after Easter said, "Open between Easter and Christmas." On the brink of Pentecost, when the church year leaves resurrection behind, we desperately need to know that resurrection joy is not only possible beyond Easter, but actually possible for our present. That resurrection is not some future life with mansions and rooms and crowns, insert your heavenly wishes here, but where joy really and truly breaks into the present. Is that what Jesus wants us to hear on this last Sunday of the Easter season? Wait, that's the lectionary committee talking, but could this be what Jesus wants us to hear before he's arrested and put on trial and then crucified? That joy is here and possible now and in what is to come? Is this what it means to be human? That when we hold together the divine and the human, God and the Word made flesh, we are somehow miraculously, insanely holding together every hard thing that it means to be human with the joy that our being human can mean? So as we move into the season of Pentecost, or in other words, the long season of life, this is what we need to remember, I think. This is what we need to know and realize, that on this last Sunday of Easter, joy is there when you don't feel it. Joy can be heard when your ears can't hear it. Joy is visible when you cover your eyes from seeing the pain. Such is the Christian life, is it not? Whatever story you need to imagine that captures both at the same time, the aching of humanity with the profound joy of faith, I think that's at the heart of Jesus' prayer. Where do you go? On this Sunday after Mother's Day, I am reminded of a Mother's Day a couple of years ago. My oldest son wakes up, comes into the kitchen where I am unloading the dishwasher, because what else would a mother do on Mother's Day? Yet it was a day like no other, because every morning in our house, when he came down from his bedroom, he would check to see how much he had grown. And of course he expected to be growing overnight. And every morning I would humor him. I'd shrink a little and say, "Sig, you have totally grown. You're almost as tall as I am. How can that happen?" He so desperately wanted to be taller than I, and he couldn't stand it when I wore heels. But that morning, and I'll never forget it, I never will, he actually was taller. He really was. There was no more feigning, there was no abating, there was no more pretending, there was no more saying, "You are so close, Sig." He really was taller. And it's a lot easier to shrink than it is to rise on your tippy toes so as to avoid and avert the truth. And it was Mother's Day, and I wanted him to be taller, and the 12-year-old he wanted to be, and I know that it's okay that his move into maturity necessitated being measured by the height of his mother. And every single morning, I felt him slipping away. Every single morning was that crazy morning, is that crazy morning, that crazy moment, that crisis moment. Almost an excruciating moment of joy and grief, when you want them to grow and go, and yet every single part of you, every single place inside of you, every single pore of your being wants them to stay, and wants them to want you, and wants them to need you. And in that moment for me was a flashback to when I first became a mother, 9 weeks too early. He was 3 pounds, 10 ounces, this baby of mine, my first child, way before any of the birth classes I ever had. I was not prepared, wasn't even on that chapter of the book yet. And in the midst of the joy of having my first child, was an early labor, a premature birth, a significant stay in the NICU, months of therapy, 1,200 a month shots to keep him from getting the common cold. Is this what Jesus meant? That you could realize joy and heartache 12 years apart? That you could know joy and pain in one event? That you could experience joy and sadness in one single second? Yes, I think this is what Jesus meant. I think this is what Jesus had in mind. I trust that Jesus really knew, that to be human is to know the abundance of joy and the pain of letting go in the very same second. Yet what joy it is to know that Jesus lived exactly what this means.